Sam Brooks, a retired covert counterterrorism officer, quietly lives as a low-paid building security guard. His son Danny marries Victoria, a wealthy, status-conscious woman who repeatedly humiliates Sam. At the wedding, Victoria publicly questions Sam's life. In response, Sam reveals a presidential letter and his decorated classified past, exposing that he prevented major terrorist attacks and is owed millions. The revelation destroys Victoria's social standing and her family's government contracts, forcing her to reckon with the consequences of arrogance. Over months she enters therapy, loses status and family wealth, and slowly begins to learn humility and service. The harbor was glass that morning, a bright, indifferent blue. Flags snapped. A string quartet tuned just off stage. White chairs marched toward a low altar like soldiers on parade. In the hotel lobby 2 floors below, Sam Brooks smoothed his tie in a cracked mirror whose silvering had been worn thin by 1,000 hands. He folded his fingers around the cuff of a shirt he could afford because he'd chosen it, navy, unremarkable, the same color as the light he preferred to sit in. He liked the ordinary things, the smell of strong coffee at 6 a.m., the ritual of handing a stranger a name tag and letting them cross a threshold safely. He liked the way Maggie, his wife, moved through the world without announcing herself. He liked not having to explain. He had learned how to keep himself tidy in 2 separate lives, the one that had once moved by night over distant deserts and the one that hummed quietly now under fluorescent office lights. Both lives had shaped him, both had cost him. Outside, bridesmaids in satin laughed and checked phones. Inside, a woman in an expensive coat swept through the lobby like a gust, Victoria Hayes. She carried a purse that could have bought the car Sam drove. She wore that small, flawless smile that meant she had already judged the world and found it wanting. She paused when she saw him, eyes sliding from the tie to his hands, cataloging his shoes. That look was a language Sam recognized, the one that turned people into labels rather than people. "Hello," she said, light like a knife. "You're Danny's father, yes?" The name tugged at him the way a title does, his son who'd grown into a man Sam watched with measured pride. "I am," Sam answered. The answer was simple, his pause added no more. Victoria's lips formed a polite tilt. "You know, this venue has very strict standards." She glanced at his name tag with the half-smile of someone marking an order. "We wouldn't want anything," raising eyebrows. The implied distance was immediate and cold as winter water. Sam felt something small and old release inside him, a dull ballast. He'd been brushed aside before, he would be brushed aside again. For 30 years he'd learned the difference between quiet humility and being unseen. He had a body that bore the ledger of both worlds, a limp from a mission's cost, a scar along his palm, the tired set of a jaw that had learned to shut. He wore his humility by choice. That afternoon, his uniform wasn't a defense, it was a deliberate theft of attention from a life he had chosen to protect others by letting them think what they wanted. Maggie arrived like a calm tide, the only person who could touch his quiet and make it less lonely. She reached for his hand without ritual, squeezing a little harder than necessary. "Don't let her ruin it," she whispered. Her voice was threaded with worry and a certainty only married empathy grants. She had watched him shrink for the sake of their family. He looked at his reflection again, not the man he had been when government seals named him, not the myths he had kept in cold safes and locked memories. Just Sam. He folded his hands, felt the small scar there, and let the suit be armor of a different kind. Today was not about secrets. Today was about family. The harbor wind slid under the entrance awning like a warning bell, and in the distance, the muffled applauding of staff setting crystal chandeliers in place began to build. Sam smiled. It was not a smile that conceded, it was one that made space, for his son, for his wife, and for whatever truth the day would ask him to hold. The week before the wedding carried the same quiet, compounding weight as an older man's silence. In their small apartment, bills lived on top of old newspapers, a thrifty realism stitched into every corner. Danny called at odd hours between deployments of code and meetings, his voice always held that middle ground between apology and defense. "Dad, she's serious about this wedding," he said into Sam's evening coffee steam. "She wants everything perfect. Please just sit with your family. No drama. Okay?" Sam said nothing about secrets. He had told Maggie about glimpses, the occasional encrypted ring of a government phone, the way letters sometimes arrived in envelopes stamped with capitals and tight fonts. Maggie had only ever answered with steady little rituals. "We saved what we could," she said, counting coupons and rationing kindness into the margins of their life. That was their normal, the life Sam had chosen because normal kept Maggie safe. At rehearsal, the yacht club looked like a photograph, polished teak, salt-slick light, and chairs aligned like obedient citizens. Victoria worked the room like a general, checking angles, rehearsing smiles. Her family spoke loudly in the cluster reserved for success, the kind of laughter that never needed to be heard twice. She touched Danny's arm quickly, showing ownership like a title deed. "Sam should sit with vendors," she said once, as if making logistics into a verdict. "It'll be easier for everyone." Her voice landed like a branded stamp, she had declared, and thus it existed. Patricia Hayes, her mother, nodded, agreed social expectation. Danny's face went tight, as if the wrong note had been struck in a tune he once loved. That night Sam walked home along the harbor and thought about place. He knew well the way small cruelties accumulate, the paused introduction, the joke that becomes a litany, the way a human being is reduced to a role. But he also knew the currency he carried, not money, not a glossy pedigree, but an inventory of harms prevented and lives kept whole. Those were the things not written on casual resumes. They lived in scars and in the way a stranger stopped to hold a child's stroller upright when an unseen hazard lurked. A staff meeting at the venue provided the first hint that his old life had not entirely relinquished him. A man in a conservative suit, posture precise, earpiece glinting, approached the security desk. "Mr. Brooks," he said, voice even. "We need to verify some records before the evening's event." Sam answered and gave them his simple Cambridge address. The man nodded, leaving a card with a department imprint. Small ripples. The men left. Someone else in a group nodded at Sam with an odd familiarity and turned away. It was enough to begin knitting curiosity into the room's air. Victoria watched these small exchanges the way a strategist studies weather. She felt uncertainty like a gap in her plan and sharpened her tongue to fill it. At the rehearsal dinner she mounted the stage with practiced grace, thanking guests and reciting the family story she had helped craft, heritage, values, preservation. When her eyes lingered on Sam, the focus shifted. She'd rehearsed this narrative for years, the one that said status smoothed edges and obscured inconvenient truths. "You know who he is," she said aloud in a voice that implied a public reckoning. The question landed like a stone, echoing beneath polished plates. The room strained toward the sound of it. Sam's hand curled around the stem of his water glass. He felt the old reflex, to protect, to withhold. But something else had joined that reflex, a refusal to become ammunition for someone else's social gain. If his silence would become a weapon against his son, then perhaps silence needed unmaking. After dinner, Victoria cornered Danny in a hallway, whispering of reputation and risk, of first impressions weighed against five-figure deals. Danny's face collapsed under the weight. "Dad is my father," he said quietly to Victoria, steady and final. "He sits with us." The refusal was both tender and brittle, it bore the weight of a marriage straining beneath a social ledger. Sam watched them from the doorway, the night air a smear of salt and light. He had choices: confront and fracture a fragile marriage, retreat and endure quiet humiliation, or allow truth the daylight it deserved. The envelope from Washington, still sealed on the hotel dresser, had not been opened. It hummed like a battery in his pocket. He thought of a lifetime of nights where other people's safety had been his assignment. He thought of Maggie, who had stayed awake while he went away. He thought of Danny, who could not be asked to choose between a wife and his name. The harbor wind pulled at a ribbon, and Sam folded his decision into the loosened evening like a letter being sealed for postage. The morning of the wedding wore a neutral face, indifferent to whatever storms humans gathered. Sam stood at the hotel window and watched guests arrive like migrating birds. A courier knocked on his door and left an envelope with a heavy seal. The crest read, Executive Office, Washington. Sam held the paper with fingers that remembered harder missions. He recognized the peculiar weight of official language. It could have been housekeeping. It could have been veterans' mail. But the timing, and the men he'd seen at the venue, made it something else, a hinge. Victoria's eyes flicked nervously in Sam's direction that morning like a hawk spotting movement. She drew Danny aside to ask in a tone that mixed panic and calculation, "Is there something you aren't telling me?" Danny's hand found her elbow and squeezed. "This is not the time," he said, voice raw with protective fatigue. "It is my wedding day." But the question had been asked, the doubt had been planted. At the reception, Crystal caught light and threw it back in little shards. Conversations flowed, someone raised a glass to good luck, music moved like restrained heat across the room. Sam took his seat at the family table, where his place felt both earned and contested. Victoria watched him as if studying a specimen. She had rehearsed this humiliation as a display of ascendancy, a symbolic clarification of who mattered. She had not expected the quiet calm that seemed to rest on him like an envelope. When Victoria rose to speak, her voice began polished, measured. "There are things family should understand about honesty," she said, prefacing the claim with a practiced smile. Sam felt the room tilt toward the spectacle she had planned. Then she stepped closer. "For 2 years," she told the crowd, "I've seen a man present himself as a humble security guard while our family supported." She paused, expecting the laughter that privileges sometimes coax. Instead, the room folded inward, listening. Sam did something small that shifted everything. He stood. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was simply a man taking his body off the bench of other people's judgment. He reached into his inner jacket and produced the presidential envelope, the seal glinting like a private promise turned public. The hush that followed was the physical sound of a plan unspooling. "You wanted to know what I do," Sam said, voice even. He opened the seal and read. The letter named him, his rank, his division, a summary that moved like a string of impossible facts into the center of the room: deeds prevented, honors earned, hazard pay authorized. The words landed with the gravity of things that cannot easily be denied. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. People around the table shifted, phones coming up like automatic reflexes. A hush was not the only thing to descend. For some, the revelation opened recognition. Colleagues of that other life stepped forward, the invisible web of gratitude threading back into immediacy. A procurement director hovered, a judge who'd once presided over a case connected to Sam's work nodded. The social currency in the room reallocated itself, faces that had been placidly indifferent folded into astonished respect. Sam placed the purple heart case on the table, a small metal story made thunderous by context. The sudden presence of proof was a kind of public exoneration. The twist was not merely in the revelation but in how it rippled. Victoria's confident script had been built on the assumption that humiliation would stick. Instead, she watched as a different ledger came due. Those who had benefited quietly from Sam's service began to speak up. Contracts, long dependent on trust and judgment, flickered under scrutiny. The murmurs became a problem she had not accounted for. Sam did not gloat. His face remained composed, almost weary. He had not sought vengeance, he had sought alignment. The truth had been a shield, and now the shield had become a reframing force. Victoria, who had weaponized status, suddenly stood demonstrably exposed. The moment turned into a calculus of consequences, and the room, which had been her stage, became a tribunal of public opinion. When the first message came, a terse email read on a phone at the head table, the letters rearranged into a new sentence: Hayes Real Estate, federal contracts under review. The room's oxygen shifted around that phrase. Victoria's hands were cold. Her world teetered. The next hour smelled of champagne and quiet panic. Conversations stuttered and reformed around new facts. People who had once deferred to pedigree now deferred to truth. The soft rustle of gowns couldn't mask the sharper sound, reputations repricing in real time. Mr. Hayes's phone buzzed, his face lost blood. A counselor for the yacht club leaned in and whispered to a manager, faces that had once leaned toward conversation now angled away. Victoria moved like someone trying to edit a paragraph after it had been printed. She walked toward Sam with an apology pre-drafted behind her lips, but the words scrabbled and slid away. "I don't know what I said," she began, voice thin, then tried to anchor herself with contrition. "I was confused. I thought," but confusion is a word that hovers when intent becomes evidence. The people who had sat politely in her orbit were now sifting through the new data and finding where their loyalties lay. Sam watched her with a steadiness that did not carry triumph. He saw the flinch in Danny's jaw, the strain in Maggie's face as she tried not to celebrate publicly a vindication that had cost someone dearly. He felt the weight of consequences, the way truth can be both remedy and ruin depending on whose hands it falls into. A representative from one of the federal procurement offices that had recently worked with Hayes Real Estate stood up, voice low but authoritative. "When our agency assesses contractors," she said, "character matters. We have obligations." The declaration was procedural, sterile. But the silence it carried was electric. Contracts were not given lightly, they could be taken under scrutiny. Sam had not asked for any retribution. He had simply allowed daylight to meet a story that had been folded for decades. The family table became an island. Those who had planned to rally like a fortress found themselves uncertain. A few attempted salvage with careful diplomacy. "We all make mistakes," said one friend, offering a bomb too thin, but the tone had already slid. Where affection had once lubricated social friction, crisp professional caution now took hold. The yacht club manager took a breath and said quietly, "We'll have to refer any outside inquiries to council." It was the phrase that signaled an institutional response. Victoria's mother, Patricia, reached for her daughter across the table, a gesture that hung between shame and protectiveness. "We'll craft a statement," she whispered. The attempt felt small. Words could not pull a reputation back through a sieve of recorded footage and witness accounts. Danny rose and found Sam in the press of faces. "Dad," he said, under his voice. "I'm sorry. For this. For making you," his sentence broke. Sam saw his son's eyes and felt the brittle hinge of a marriage pulled taut against incipient fracture. Danny's loyalty had been counted for, now its cost appeared as a ledger split down the middle. Outside, phones already carried the moment into the wider world. A server asked permission to take the presidential letter to a private room. Sam nodded, knowing the mechanism of proof traveled now where witnesses would carry it. Someone at the bar uploaded the first clip. Technology had a way of turning private upheaval into public pressure, and the clip would be a small loop that replayed itself into judgment. Sam walked through the room without fanfare. People stopped to speak, some with gratitude, some with formalities. A defense contractor who had quietly relied on Sam's research in the past pressed his hand to Sam's arm. "We'd like to talk," he said. Sam nodded. The weight of offers and obligations pressed at the edges of the room, bringing with it the discomforting realization that truth can bring recompense and obligation in equal measure. Victoria stood frozen in a pool of cooling light. Her carefully curated world had begun to feel porous, the things it fed on suddenly exposed. She tried to find support among those who had smiled at her for decades, only faces reflecting concern looked back. The room, once a stage of social choreography, had become an arena where past actions bore immediate cost. Sam did not gloat. Instead, he watched the fallout with a quiet gravity. If there was to be justice, it would not be vengeance. The moment had shifted their family's axis. The choice now would be how to live under the light, with dignity, with repair where possible, and with the courage to be accountable even when the work of repair could not return what was lost. The live clip hit the internet before the cake was cut. In minutes, the yacht club's stately halls condensed into a handful of seconds that looped and churned with commentary. The letter, the purple hearts, Victoria's face collapsing like paper in rain. The room's air changed from private to public, and the consequences that had been murmurs crystallized into decisions. Mr. Hayes's phone lit up in a pattern that spoke of boardrooms and damage control. The procurement officer's message had been succinct: "We are reviewing our relationship. Pending review, we are suspending negotiations." It was the precise verbiage of institutional distancing. Contracts that existed as quiet trust were now suspended by the weight of a recorded public humiliation. A business that had stood for decades felt a fissure open beneath its feet. Victoria's voice, when it came, was small. "I didn't mean," she began, but the room had already moved past what she meant. A judge in attendance, who had presided over a case tied to Sam's earlier operation, spoke with a measured patience that stung precisely because it trusted institutions to do their work. "Public comments like that, made in front of a crowd where our professionals attend, do require scrutiny." The words were not a vindictive instrument, they were a procedural truth. In the wake of public humiliation, institutions must reassess risk. Sam stood by, feeling the pressure of being lifted and burdened at once. People approached him with admiration and offers he had never imagined stepping into as a man who preferred quiet. "We'd like to retain your consulting services," a senior official said, low and urgent. "You don't owe us a return. We need your counsel." Sam listened, hands folded, the sum of what he'd prevented and the cost that had come with it balanced like scales. The $2.3 million back pay was real, suddenly present in an emailed authorization that the Treasury officer disclosed aloud. The number, once a secret, now glinted with a moral gravity. Victoria's world was falling in precise increments, first the contracts, then the reputational allies, then private calls from friends who felt unsure of their own association. The public record, once a place for honor, had become the marketplace where judgments were traded. Her father's face was a map of disbelief. The wealth and status she had always used as scaffolding did not hold when values and judgment recalibrated. In the center of it, Danny broke down. He moved toward his wife and found no easy currency of defense left to purchase forgiveness. "You humiliated him," he said, voice raw. "You humiliated our family." His words landed like finality. They made visible the rupture that would not be healed by statements or donations alone. It had become a question of who they were as a unit. Victoria's apology, if it could be called that, lacked depth at first. It tried to translate regret into words that would buy time. But Sam, who had watched people speak with a practiced public cadence for years, recognized when an apology had weight. He understood that the only thing that could begin to right the wrong was a meaningful reckoning, admission, work, and transformation. He looked at her, not with triumph, but with the quiet patience of someone who'd seen more damage than any one wedding could reveal. "Consequences aren't about revenge," Sam said, voice low enough to be private in the public room. "They're about the cost of choices. If you want to learn, then learn. If you want to rebuild, do the work. Don't try to erase what happened with money or PR. That won't teach what needs to be learned." Outside, the clip continued to spin across feeds and phones. Viewers chose sides mirrored in comments and shares, and the internet, as it always does, added its own judgment. But inside that room, the human cost settled as a palpable weight. Victoria's father, who had built a business from deals and networks, watched clients text one another in quiet lines. The yacht club manager took a deep breath and called his counsel. Sam watched Danny and Victoria together, two people whose marriage now existed in a new architecture of honesty and consequence. Whether it could survive would depend on whether Victoria could move past performative apologies and toward real humility, and whether Danny could hold that boundary without collapsing into regret. For Sam, the moment closed with a private sort of closure. The burden of silence he had held for decades was unlatched, and with it came not revenge but the possibility of a more honest life, for him and for those who would choose to change. Months later, the aftermath had settled into a new geography. Some things were gone, others began in small, awkward ways. Hayes' real estate restructured, the Hayes estate sold and relocated. The social invitations that had once been automatic became measured and triaged. The island community, which once traded on lineage and spectacle, learned the hard arithmetic of association. Victoria moved through those months like someone learning a new language. Therapy, the kind that prided habit and motive, became her ordinary. She learned to sit with discomfort rather than smooth it away with purchases. In a small conference room at a non-profit veterans center, she trained volunteers and learned to sort disability claims. There were no gala donations or headline opportunities, only paperwork and the steady gaze of people who had traded dignity for service in ways she had scarcely understood. "Why do you do this?" she asked one morning to a veteran she'd come to respect. He'd lost most of a leg in a distant theater. He laughed softly. "Because the work matters more than the applause," he said. "Because you learn that what keeps people whole is small acts done repeatedly." The sentence lodged in her like a stitch. For the Hayes family, consequences were now the currency of accountability. They had the option to try to buy restoration, but restoration is not a receipt. It's a long, often boring process of living differently. Richard Hayes accepted the loss of contracts like a man who had misread his own center of gravity. Patricia Hayes, relieved in a strange way, found quiet in a condo that required less performance. Danny and Victoria's marriage fractured and then, with therapy, began to remap itself. Boundaries were drawn. Danny insisted on respect. He insisted that his father be treated with the same decency he expected his spouse to show. Victoria learned to apologize, not to perform, but to acknowledge and then change. She made no promises about erasing the damage to her family's business. She could not claim that authority. But she could start being someone who did not reduce others for her comfort. Small things marked the distance, a call to Sam that began with humility, Danny's new insistence on shared values when they made decisions. Sam and Maggie returned to their ordinary with the odd newness of overdue recognition. Offers came in that he considered like tools rather than trophies, consultancy that would use his expertise, a chance to advise without re-entering a life he had left behind. He accepted enough to give Maggie a cushion and to offer Danny a measure of security, but he kept the things that had made normal precious: quiet dinners, grocery coupons, the way his son would call at midnight when code and life pulled him away. On a cold morning some months later, Victoria visited the apartment unannounced. She sat with quiet shame and with a new sort of resolve. She looked at the framed presidential letter on the wall and at the purple heart case Sam had left where Maggie could see it. "I read about Operation Sandstorm," she said finally. "I read about what you did. I don't expect forgiveness. I want to know how to be better." Sam considered the question for a long while. He thought about the men he had carried out of deserts, the long habit of silence he had kept for the sake of others, and the complicated mercy of consequence. "Start small," he said. "Start by listening. Then by acting. Humility is a muscle." Victoria stayed. She learned to answer the questions she had once asked with arrogance, with curiosity, with honest labor rather than demand. The work of repair was slow and sometimes humiliating. The non-profit receptionist mispronounced her name. The social circles closed their doors. But she kept showing up. In the end, the story was less about punishment and more about the way truth has gravity. It rearranges where people stand. Sam kept his ordinary because he had chosen it. He kept his quiet because it was a gift to Maggie and to the life they had together. He had gained money and offers and the world's late applause, but that had never been the point. The point had always been what the quiet life taught: service that asks for nothing in return, and the courage to let truth land even when it hurts those you love. When Danny hugged him one evening on the apartment stoop, he did not squeeze as a son apologizing, he squeezed as a son recognizing what had always been true. "You taught me more than I thought," he said. Sam's reply was small and whole: "Good. That's enough." Across the water, Martha's Vineyard had learned a lesson of its own. that reputation is fragile when built on dismissal, and that a life lived in real service will not be erased by a satin dress or a loud toast. Some people used the lesson to change. For others, the lesson remained a caution etched into memory. The frame stayed on Sam's walls as a quiet testament. Honor is a thing lived, not merely announced, and consequence is the honest meter by which actions are finally measured.